It's Tay with the Beginner Drawing course, and today I'm going to walk you through drawing a dragon. Let's get started. So first and foremost, you want to start off by figuring out the neckline and drawing a ball for the head. Now, I use this particular kind of way of drawing for most limbs or most extensions of a body, or in terms of where I want something to start or begin or end. You can see I'm just sort of roughing in the cylinder around this main line, which I like to call the line of action, something I learned in animation, most of my animation classes in college, so it's really helpful for drawing. The circle represents the head or the part of the skull, like if you look at people's heads or the head of most things, you can kind of start it with a circle, or you can start it with another, shape like a square. If you like squares better, it will kind of dictate how the rest of the process goes. So as you can see, we're just kind of also rolling along the form of the lines that we drew in terms of the cylindrical kind of neck musculature that happens to appear in our dragon. And we're also using a mixture of line. I want you to notice that as well. So we're not just using curved lines, we can also use some straighter lines, some angled diagonal lines, because these straight lines are going to contrast nicely with some of our curved lines, just to create that nice curved versus straight effect. So now I'm going to scale this guy up a little bit so that we can actually see what we're doing. So as far as the proportions of the face are concerned, you really want to reference animals that already exist, so you know the ratio of like how big the eyes are to how big, say, the muzzle is, or how far back the mouth goes into the body. So I always have reference up when I'm using these types of videos, whether it's art I like. Most of the time I'm just using Pinterest. So I'm going to look at some of that reference, and I'm going to just strike some lines for the general shape of the head. And if I don't like them, we'll just erase them and try again. So right now the neck to me doesn't look like it can support that much head. The head's getting kind of meaty. So I want to make sure that I have enough neck musculature to be able to hold the head up. So I'm going to go ahead and just expand my design a little here. Create some of those armor plates. I'm still exploring because, again, I don't draw a ton of dragons, which means I need to be able to be free to explore. And I'm guessing if you don't draw a lot of dragons, you're going to need that exploration phase too. And one thing I'll do is I'll probably sketch a couple different dragons and just kind of talk you through that process, just because I want you to see that you don't always have to go with the first drawing. You can go ahead and, test a couple different ones and see how they're all looking. Just throwing in some teeth here, so that you can make the final drawing the one that you like the most. So now that we have this sort of dragon head, I'm going to try to do some quicker sketches using the same methods you saw here, and just make sure that I'm really trying to get the best possible sketch to move forward with. So here's what that looks like. Kind of coming toward the camera a little bit more. So I'm just striking this line and imagining it going back in space and coming forward in space. So back is back here, forward is up here, and then there's our head, and we're doing a different angle this time. So you can strike a middle line, which is often helpful. And then, the eyes are sort of these uh, like egg shapes, but you're just doing one line and meeting it underneath. So a bit like an egg, bit like an oval, and that's helpful for making it look inset, making it look like it has a brow ridge. So this one, since I'm still warming up, is already turning out pretty cool. Again, using the midline to create some volume and dimension. And then try and think about, the bones of the dragon, the bone structure, the cheekbones, how the brow ridge is going to jut out and create that cool kind of design. So in this instance, it feels like the third time is the charm. So I'm going to be probably finishing this guy, which means that I don't need to get too crazy with my details now. I'm going to be drawing over him. This is basically a good starting point for our next level of sketch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lock the layer transparency here, which is this weird little checkerboard symbol, and then I'm going to hit Option Delete to make him look blue, which is going to help me go over the drawing with a more certain look. So let's drop the opacity on him, make a layer above, and start to go to work. So what I'm doing already is I'm actually working in a detailed way right off the bat because I know that there's going to be a lot of detail in this guy. And that means if I want to be efficient, I'm going to be making spikes all the way out from wherever I'm starting my drawing. I'm still thinking about things like the weight of the lines, meaning, how dark or how many times I run over that line to kind of darken it. And I'm still thinking about the shapes here, which are these sort of, striking a line and then kind of meeting it for the eyes. And that's something I learned really early on in my artistic journey, and I've just used that shape a lot since. So you can see we already kind of know where our nostrils are. And you can start with the facial features and just kind of work your way back. Sometimes I'll strike some lines I'm not a huge fan of, but a lot of this is also just to give that feeling, and I'm looking at my reference board here too, a lot of feeling of depth and dimension. So making marks like this, which are a very common type of drawing mark, are to help me not only create detail, but create form. So it kind of does a lot of things all at once. You'll learn about different line types if you watch the first free lesson of the beginner drawing course. I'm going to save this guy, and already you can see that we're kind of bringing this next drawing level out just by having the initial base drawing. And I know I'm going to need to sharpen my lines over this brow ridge, which is why I'm being very cognizant of that. And I'll kind of check in later as I'm making progress because it's actually going to take me a little while. So we'll talk about the best parts and the parts that are going to help you draw your dragon. But for right now, I'm going to focus in and keep attacking it. Okay, so right here I want to mention the repetition of shape. So one thing to give your drawings form and structure and make them seem organized and designed is repetition. So I talk about pattern recognition in things like my How to Draw a Rose video, but another thing to keep in mind is when you're recognizing patterns like, the repeating of teeth or the repeating of a certain type of mark, you are creating design by repeating that pattern. So when you're looking at like the design of a tooth, these are all relatively similar. They're all these little diamond shapes, and I can just keep making these diamond shapes all the way down to the edge of the mouth and figure out, the next kind of shapes I'm going to be using are going to be similar to the ones that I used before, because that is how design works. It is something that has a symmetry to it. It has a logic to it. And it's just something I wanted to touch on as I'm making my way down to the mouth area, because you can see that this repetition is helping to create the effect of having a cohesive design, which is helpful. It's just something to think about as you're progressing in your dragon drawing, because if you're making all sorts of random shapes and each tooth looks different, I'll mess up on purpose. So basically, one shape kind of like that, then one maybe square shape here, square-ish shape, and then we'll do a circular shape. You can see that it's really not coming together. It doesn't really feel cohesive. It doesn't feel like it's designed well. So one thing that's kind of a hack that you don't want to overdo any of this stuff is just to find the repetition of shape that is going to make it feel like you kind of have a sense of what you're doing. It's less exploratory at this point and more like, yes, I know that there's, this many teeth leading down. And to keep those teeth in a relatively good line as well. So using that as a method of kind of creating depth and dimension. All right, so you see as I'm working on this very light portion and I'm kind of knocking back the opacity a little bit more and letting the drawings kind of dance against one another. You know, I'm looking at the previous drawing, I'm looking at the current drawing, just to make sure that I am following the design enough and following what I laid out for myself, but I'm not, you know, too beholden to it. The big shapes, yes, the little shapes, not so much. And when I'm getting down here to the point of, you know, getting these other teeth back there, I'm looking like this is actually a pretty good guide of where to go next. I don't need to deviate too far from this because I'll start to lose something that my subconscious, as I was sketching, started to figure out. So half the battle when you're working on, you know, the second level of the drawing is just to keep certain parts and knowing what to keep versus what to change. And that's something that you just sort of get good at the more you do this process. And that's something that I just wanted to bring to your attention at this point. I'm making these marks to kind of help add depth and detail, but again, dimension, because I want these parts to kind of recede back, and these marks tell your eye that it is. It follows the jawline, but they're perpendicular to it, meaning that if the jaw is going this way, the lines are going that way. And they're not touching, so it doesn't look like they're flattening out. They're just on top of it, creating that detail and dimension that way. You can see I'm trying to keep a symmetry here between this part of the jawline and this part of the jawline, and still kind of figure out the anatomy of this side of the face. So something that I'm really trying to keep in mind is the symmetry between the sort of midline and also trying to keep the different pieces of the dragon overlapping properly so that we can really get a sense of the depth. So for example, this might not be working so well to try and get that to work on this side, but sometimes you just have to throw a couple lines down and try to have them fight and see which ones come out on top. Look at your other sketch over here, see if it's still reading, because it should read from really far away. And the way you do that is by having these shapes overlapping well and having a good amount of clarity to that overlap. And if you're zooming out and you're like, okay, does this still work? Does that still, you know, look like this is coming in front of that and that's kind of showing up the way I want? Maybe you notice things like, okay, well, the nose is maybe a little far apart for what I'm going for, the nostril. And then you're like, just evaluating from a couple different positions. You know, it can be easy to be lost if you're always zoomed in, but if you're always zoomed out, it's really hard to do detail. So that's why you have the flipping of the canvas as well as the zooming in and zooming out, because we're checking for different things. We're checking for our proportions, we're checking for the big read, the details, and the only way to do that is to work at various levels of zooming in and zooming out, and to flip the canvas back and forth horizontally. You can also turn it sideways to check your shapes as well, because you'll see your drawing differently that way. And you know, you can kind of check in a more abstract or fresh-eyed way if things are looking the way you want them to look. All right, so for the rest of the video, you're going to be with narrator slash editor Tay, as I had to focus in and work on the rest of this dragon. So basically, I stayed at this level of zoom so that I could continue to kind of finish out the big shapes of the drawing, including the horns, including the neck, and just creating little marks here and there like I showed you to give you that depth and dimension. But I am also going back in and erasing certain marks and sketching over what I had already sketched on. Now, you could make a whole nother sketch for this, you know, drop the opacity down on this one and do the lines over again, but for a second level sketch or something that's not entirely going to be super finished, that's a bit overkill. But what you can do is just shade certain parts of it, like the underside of the neck, as I mentioned earlier. I'm just using that same mark, that same kind of perpendicular mark that runs up and down the cylinder of the neck. So if you're noticing the pattern here, it's basically that everything kind of boils down to those primitive shapes of cylinders, cubes, spheres, using all those things you learned to make things more complicated looking and making sure that those complicated looking shapes are in proportion and that they have a symmetry to them and they have a design and you're using them appropriately. So this is basically the name of the game. It's just to continue to push those basics further and further, and I teach you all those basics in my beginner drawing course. There's now 2 editions of the course. It's over 24 weeks of drawing goodness if you do want to enroll in that. Otherwise, you can check out the free lessons on the website. All this is in the description box, but this is essentially where I landed after about another hour and a half. So it took me about half an hour to sketch the initial dragons and choose one, and then another 90 minutes to get it to this point. All right, so this is where we ended with our dragon. I hope you had fun drawing along. Remember to use your line of action and your basic shapes like your cylinders and your spheres, and then just kind of running the midline in order to draw out the different proportions and just kind of sketch from there and be comfortable in that process. So I'll see you in the next video. Feel free to like, thumbs up, subscribe, all that good stuff. We're going to keep going through all the How to Draw series, so it's going to teach you how to draw really well by the end. If you want to augment your learning and go even faster and understand fundamental artistic principles to let you draw pretty much anything, check out thebeginnerdrawingcourse.com for free lessons and more. I'll see you in the next one. Take care and happy drawing.